Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're going to discuss about Phalaenopsis Orchid once again, and this is because one of my viewers suggested that I make a video on how to know what's wrong with a Phalaenopsis just by looking at the leaves. So today I'm going to show you a whole bunch of things you might see at some point or another with your Phalaenopsis. What do these things mean, if they're bad, if they're not bad, and so on and so forth. So let's get to it. One of the most common ailments you will see with a Phalaenopsis orchid is really droopy and limpy leaves. Sometimes they can even be slightly leathery. Now, this is a sign of dehydration. There is a lack of pressure within the orchid and the leaves, making them limp like this. It's not normal, and it means the orchid needs water. But dehydration can have two causes. One, you simply forgot to water, or the orchid was not watered in a long time, case in which we're lucky and we're gonna solve the issue just by watering the orchid. Or the second possibility, the roots have died inside the pot and the orchid cannot hydrate herself simply because it does not have roots. In this case, the process is more laborious and it implies us trying to induce new root production, which I will not get into right now, but I will add in the description a video which talks about it. But bottom line, if you ever have an orchid with droopy leaves like this, and you know the orchid was not like this when you received it or when you purchased it, it is definitely dehydration. Make sure the orchid is watered in time. If the medium and the roots are dry, give it a good watering, and in a few days things should be better. Next up, we have yellowing leaves. Under certain circumstances, these are normal. Phalaenopsis orchids regularly shed the oldest leaves, and these are the bottom ones. Every year or every 2 years, Phalaenopsis orchids might lose the bottom 2 leaves, maximum 3 leaves. And how it's going to happen is that the leaves will start to yellow to the point of completely drying out, and at some point you will be able to manually detach it from the orchid. So it's normal if the bottom leaves do that. 2 leaves, maximum 3 leaves, that's normal. However, if the yellowing leaves are further up or worse on the top, that is a reason for concern, and usually it happens because of stem rot and crown rot. Again, I will not go into the details because there is a whole procedure to treat an orchid, but I'll link you down below to videos I made about this subject, my own recipe of non-toxic treatments for crown rot that actually has worked for me. So I hope if you ever encounter crown rot that this will help you out. But just know about the yellowing leaves. Bottom ones, 2 or 3, in most cases it's normal. Yellowing leaves towards the top, it's not normal. And if the leaves completely yellow and fall off, it's most probably a rot infection. If they don't fall off and they have patches of yellow, well, that's a different story, and we'll get to that in this video. Next up, smaller leaves in comparison to the older leaves. Phalaenopsis orchids grow by producing new leaves each year. In good conditions, the new leaves created will be at least as big, if not bigger, as the previous leaves, but in some cases, some Phalaenopsis will produce very tiny leaves in comparison to the older leaves. This means only one single thing: stress. But this stress can be caused by multiple reasons. Let me just explain the phenomenon and then we'll get to the stress causes. An orchid consumes energy to produce its structures. This energy is actually the nutritious sap, the sugars that the orchid consumes. In normal conditions and without stress factors, an orchid knows very well how to assign how much quantity goes to what structure, and in the end all of the structures grow to their full potential, full capacity, and they function normally. But when something debalances it, it will start pulling energy from some structures and allocate it to the new and unexpected events it has encountered. Therefore, the structures it produces will not be as big as the previous ones, since they didn't have the same amount of energy put into them. The unforeseen events that consume energy can be loss of roots, or change in environment, or transplant shock if we repotted the orchid, or getting adjusted to a new medium, or recovering from a very abundant flowering, especially with the complex hybrids, which can be unpredictable and can bloom a little bit more than they should. Smaller leaves are very common with new orchids, with orchids you just repotted or converted into a new medium, with orchids that just lost their roots, or even if an orchid loses too many leaves. Since photosynthesis takes place in the leaves, a lack of leaves means less photosynthesis, less energy. Therefore, less energy allocated for structures. So now that we understand what stress is and that it has to do with the energy, we can start looking for the culprit. If our orchid starts to produce smaller and smaller leaves, it means there's something bugging her. So we need to think about its history. When did we purchase it? Did it receive enough light or enough water in the store? Did we repot it? Did the orchid have enough roots or lost some roots? Does it have enough leaves or did it lose a lot of leaves? If we can find a culprit and we can explain the behavior, then everything is all right. If we make sure the orchid gets the care it requires, with time and with production of more and more new leaves, they will get bigger and bigger, as you can see, and pretty much the situation will become normal and the orchid will function properly. In some cases, this behavior is unavoidable. If we just saved an orchid from root rot, or we know it suffered in the store, or even in our care, if we know it had a pest infestation, then recovery can actually mean smaller structures until the orchid is healthier. However, if we cannot really tell what's the cause, then it must be something with our care or in our environment. Is the orchid receiving too much light or not enough light? Is the orchid receiving fertilizer and nutrients which contribute to the formation of structures? Is the orchid watered when it should be watered? Are the roots of my orchid okay? We need to check all of these things because if we cannot really pinpoint the stress source, it usually means it's something we are doing, which doesn't really agree with her. So do make a checklist and put as many factors that you know might stress her and see if it's the case if they're happening in your environment. Next up, chlorosis spots on the leaves. By chlorosis, we mean a discoloration which is typically yellow and looks like a dot in the leaves, as you can see on this Phalaenopsis orchid. This is a very typical sign of the #1 pest that Phalaenopsis attract, and this is the red or false spider mite. Now, this mite carries a virus and can transmit a virus which gives out this pattern, this chlorosis on the leaves. It's not necessarily the grazing of the insects. This is the orchid flag virus, and in cultivation there are only a handful of orchids affected by this virus. It just so happens that Phalaenopsis are the most prone. So this is probably the most common pest damage you will see with a Phalaenopsis orchid, since they do have this weakness against spider mites. I'll add down below my videos on the orchid flag virus and how to get rid of the spider mite. The spider mite can also leave behind grazing marks. That is the actual damage of the spider mite, and I don't have one at hand right now, but usually with Phalaenopsis, the grazing is accompanied by this pitting of the leaf, and even if you get rid of the spider mite, the pitting will continue to new leaves less and less, and with a bit of luck, it will completely subside, but in a lot of years. Since it's a virus, there is no known cure for viruses in plants, so all we need to do is let the immune system of the orchid fight off the virus. All we can do is make sure the orchid is not stressed, is receiving nourishment, water, good conditions, so that her immune system is strong enough to fight off the virus. But again, it might last quite a few years, and an infestation with spider mites is absolutely dreadful if you don't take action. And I know because I had it in overall, I think it affected 20 or 30 of my Phalaenopsis orchids, and in extreme cases, it can actually kill orchids. So don't take spider mites lightly. Luckily, I do have a non-toxic treatment for them. You can check it down below in the description. If you want to go with the more toxic chemical route, which I did too, but I wasn't happy with the result, do go for a miticide, not any insecticide. Spider mites are spiders. They're not affected by insecticides. You need something specific for spider mites. Next, discolored patches on the leaves. Now, discoloration can occur for a few various reasons, so I'll take the most common ones. This little discoloration or spot here might mean exposure to sun, might be the beginning of a sunburn. I don't have a really severe example at hand, but I did film one. In severe cases, Phalaenopsis orchids can get really burned by direct sunshine. They are sensitive to it. These are low light plants. They cannot really stand hot sun because it heats the leaves very fast. fast and causes burns. So as you can see, in severe cases, all of the leaves can get burned. But in mild cases, a little sunburn looks something like this. And this is most probably what happened to this orchid, because I know it did have a day where the sun hit her leaves. Other times, this coloration can mean a deficiency. And I'm presuming this leaf in the back is a deficiency, and this one as well. I had a few more severe examples along the years. A deficiency is not necessarily patchy like a sunburn. Sometimes you can have a discolored leaf tip or discolored edges throughout the leaf. Discoloration usually means a lack of magnesium or a lack of nitrogen, which help with the formation of chlorophyll. So make sure that you are fertilizing an orchid with a fertilizer especially created for orchids, if you're a beginner especially. And also look on the label of the fertilizer and see what nutrients it contains. It should have N, P, and K, but also micronutrients. It would be a really strong bonus if your fertilizer had magnesium and calcium in some cases. Deficiencies are harder to spot, and sometimes people just see a little patch and think, oh, magnesium, or see something and think, oh, calcium, but it's usually not the case. Orchids are not heavy feeders, and if you're already fertilizing on a regular basis, chances that you have a deficiency is really not that high. I would first check the external factors, stress factors, and all of those things before I resorted to nutrients. If, however, you know you don't fertilize, you might want to start to. Next up, black patches on the leaves. Usually these are infections, fungal infections or bacterial infections, and they can be caused by multiple things such as standing water on the leaf, because in our homes we don't grow orchids like they should be grown in nature, so water doesn't slide off, is not evaporated by the wind. It usually stays on the leaf and can create problems. So if water stood on the leaf excessively, particularly in cold temperatures, it can lead to an accumulation of bacteria, which will cause something like this. But other causes can include a little grazing or a little wound on the leaf that can get infected, rarer cases, but anyway, black patches usually mean infection. Now, it's not all bad, because orchids do have an immune system. They are capable of stopping infections on their own, sometimes. This is the case with my orchid. I have this infection on it for a year now. It actually arrived with this, and it's a result of actually standing water on the leaf, being packaged with that water. The temperature outside was a little cold. It arrived to me with this little infection, which doesn't look very sightly, but the leaf is perfectly functional. No point in me cutting it, so I just let it be. In some cases, infections need to be removed, and this is when they start to advance and take over more and more of the leaf, particularly if they happen towards the edge. You do want to cut them. Now, I do have a tutorial, of course, down below in the description on how to cut an infected portion of a leaf while leaving a clean or healthy portion intact. There is a proper way to do that as well, so if you're interested, do check it down below. Black patches can sometimes be accompanied by yellow patches as well. That's usually the bacterial infection, which is more, let's say, dangerous than the fungal one. It really depends on what it is. There are multiple ailments. But bottom line, if it doesn't spread and it's purely visual, everything is okay. I don't think you should go ahead and cut the leaf and reduce the photosynthesis potential of your plant. If it, however, progresses and you can see it affect the leaf more and more each day, definitely it should be cut away. Next up, red or purple tinges on the leaves, particularly on the underside of the leaf. I know it's this trend to think it's magnesium deficiency, but really it's not. You can start treating your orchid with magnesium and most probably you'll see it doesn't help. So things are purely based on context. If you know you're not fertilizing, then you definitely should. And this might not be necessarily a result of that, but it's good for you to consider it, because you really should fertilize your orchid and nourish it if you want to maintain it for years and years and years. Most of the times, Phalaenopsis which have this pigment display it because they do have it in their system. The red or purple pigment is called anthocyanin. And if you look at my orchid, we can see that the tips are also reddish in color. And also the flower spike is reddish in color as well. And the orchid, you don't know this, but you'll have to take my word for it, is purple, has purple flowers. So she does have quite a great amount of anthocyanin in her system. However, anthocyanin, besides being a beautiful pigment for blooms, it also has a role in protecting the orchid. Therefore, with orchids, anthocyanin and this pigment shows off more the brighter the light is, because it comes to protect the orchid from UV rays and even from burns. So even with a Phalaenopsis orchid, the more bright light we provide, not necessarily sunshine, but bright light, the redder it can get. However, as I told you, you have to think about the context. If you know your orchid is sitting in very cold temperatures, you can actually experience this pigment as well. But in that case, it comes to protect the leaves from cold damage. But generally, it is nothing to worry about if you know you are providing good care for your orchid and you're not exaggerating with light or cold temperatures. And you're also feeding your orchid. Now, if an orchid doesn't have considerable amounts of anthocyanin, it will most probably not display that pigmentation. This is an orchid that comes from the very same shelf under the very same light as the other one, which is artificial light, by the way. And you can see I don't have red root tips, I have green tips. I also don't have red tinges on the leaves of my orchid, and the flower spike is green, but I hope you can see by the looks of the buds, this is a light colored Phalaenopsis. It's actually white. So because it's not purple, it doesn't really have excessive anthocyanin pigments in it. It doesn't need it. In case of emergency, this orchid can produce anthocyanin as well, but it's just not going to be all that visible as the other orchid. And also because these two orchids are treated in the same way, fed in the same way, and receive the very same light, the context here is not fertilizer, is not light, it's nothing but, well, the coloration, the natural coloration of the hybrid. Now, sometimes you might be able to see some patterns forming on the leaves of your orchids too, in particular light situations. Hopefully you can see on the first leaf here, we have some patterning going on. This is absolutely normal. It's a sort of texture that orchids do get from time to time. As they form, they are protected in some cases with a glaucose texture, and check the link below to learn what that is. Just think about grapes. You know how grapes have this little grayish like a powder on them? Well, Phalaenopsis can have it too, and not only. And as the leaves form, this powder can be patchy, as you can see. It's nothing to worry about, it's perfectly normal, and I know somebody asked me about it, so that's why I'm showing it off. Another problem we might encounter is split leaves. A split down the center of the leaf can appear sometimes on our Phalaenopsis orchid, and many articles suggest this is a hydration problem. Mainly if the orchid gets dehydrated and then rehydrated, the tension in the leaf can increase rapidly and cause a split down the center. To be fully honest with you, I didn't really notice this happening. Because of rehydration, I had split leaves on Phalaenopsis orchids which were perfectly hydrated and healthy. It does indeed indicate there is a pressure issue that has been applied maybe unevenly. Maybe the leaf is a little bit mutated in the sense that it's contorted, it doesn't have a proper shape, and it splits. Whatever the case might be, it is a common occurrence and it doesn't really mean your orchid is sick. It might just be a one-time thing, or if you didn't notice that your orchid was dehydrated and then you watered it properly and then the split occurred, well, that's your reason. For this one, I don't really have an example, but I'll tell you about it. Sometimes on Phalaenopsis leaves, you can observe some bumps that appear to be blisters. Well, these are called edema, and I'll share with you an article down below. Apparently, they form due to cold watering. They're most prevalent in the colder season, but if you water an orchid with very cold water, you can have those bumps on the leaves as well. Don't try to remove them because they're not a pest, not scale, and also they don't have infection or anything inside. Do check the article down below to learn more. And lastly, mechanical damage. And I have a little bit of a bruise or a scar here on my orchid. This has been done through handling, it wasn't done by me, but sometimes leaves do get bruised or ripped or broken. Usually they will patch themselves off, you don't really need to do anything. If it's a very big bruise or a very big cut, you can apply a bit of cinnamon powder, the one you find in supermarkets, and that will make sure the drying is faster. But if the orchid has bruises of the sorts, that's perfectly okay. The orchid took care of them and they don't pose a threat to the orchid. They will not get infected once dried. Sometimes Phalaenopsis orchids can have little dots or little freckles or tiny little purple patterns on their leaves, particularly when they're new. That's absolutely normal, it doesn't mean anything. The complex hybrids have, as the name suggests, a complex parentage. Maybe one of her parents did have a natural pattern. Some species of Phalaenopsis do have beautiful leaves with really nice patterns. So this is just a remnant of that, and you really shouldn't worry about it. And in the end, Phalaenopsis can be really different between them. Some have darker leaves, some have lighter leaves. It doesn't really matter the quantity of light because the rule doesn't always apply, particularly with the complex hybrids. You can have a very dark-leaved Phalaenopsis hybrid next to a really light-colored Phalaenopsis hybrid in the same amount of light. It doesn't mean that one has a deficiency or doesn't receive enough light in comparison to the other. It just means it's different. So I hope this video gave you some ideas on the most important things to look for, and for the other things which might scare you, just think about the context. So alrighty guys, thank you for watching this video. Hope it was useful, particularly for beginners. And you know the drill, if you've enjoyed it, give this video a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!